Surprise! Welcome to the Monday, January 5th edition of the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast. Jake and I here for one more show post Week 18. We'll
It's
kind
a
of
victory lap, right?
yeah. I mean, we
One
did a
more.
victory lap already last week too. Just the
Yeah,
people demand we do one more, Jake. So that's what we get
I
to
guess
have
so,
here.
yeah.
I have been asking people a lot on the different Sirius XM shows I've been doing, both on the RotoWire One, Angel Fire Radio on Saturdays as well too. What has been your biggest takeaway from this year, and what are ways that we can learn or draft better for next year? So Jake and I'll be kind of expanding upon that. I have my own answer, more or less, that we'll have on the podcast side of things, and more importantly, I think for a lot of people, if you're still interested in the fantasy aspect of this year. Playoff fantasy, I feel like, has been a bigger thing than ever. Whether it's our partnership with Draftkings or you have other stuff on other platforms, we have like some side playoff ones as well too. That I know our guy Alan Slosky will be moderating here come this week as we have the postseason officially set. A pretty ho hum, boring Week 18. I think this year more than ever illustrated why you should not have playoff games. On Week 18, it was pretty horrendous, at least from the game's perspective. So I'm excited to talk about contests that actually matter here for the postseason and the implications
absolutely.
for
The NFL
that.
says extend the season one more week, and this is what they get. So I guess, I mean, the starters are resting for the playoff. Seeding's mostly wrapped up, and now we can get into some games that matter this week. It's looking to be a pretty tight wild card weekend, so that's going to be fun.
Before we do that, let's talk about some of the things that we learned from this year. And Jake, you've been boots in the ground really since June. I've been doing podcasts with at least Nick Whalen back even before then with the NFL draft. Like, I think I have accumulated plenty of hot takes that were correct or maybe not correct. And my thought process, for the most part, I felt like was pretty sound. Maybe some injury things didn't impact, but a lot of the hot button issues in fantasy, I thought that you and I had been on the right side of entering this year. There were at least a few things that I had written down as to what I will be adjusting towards next year. But was there one of the was the one big takeaway for you, or a couple big takeaways that you had for what you want to improve upon for next year, or things you want to keep in mind when you're drafting for 2026?
Well, I think the biggest one out of my notes that I say that is a lesson learned, which is something we generally preach during the draft, and we know it's very comfortable to be taking quarterbacks in the third or fourth round, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they're the highest scorers in fantasy, and we'll talk about this a little bit in playoff strategy here. But I think this year, more than any other year, emphasize that you shouldn't do that. That wait on quarterbacks should be a thing in fantasy, and this is, of course, single quarterback redraft leagues here. And it was illustrated more than anything this year. I mean, you had Josh Allen burn a lot of people in the playoffs. You had Jalen Hurts have a really rough stretch run. And then whether it was Lamar Jackson, Joe Burrow, or Jaden Daniels, it was mostly due to injuries that they burned you. But even when, outside of Burrow down the stretch, I mean, chances are you might have been buried already. But there was not such great play there, even when they were out on the field, because, they were playing through injury or whatnot. And, meanwhile, in terms of fantasy points per game, I'm going to use it doesn't matter for quarterbacks, but I'm using Yahoo PPR average fantasy points per game throughout this show here, even when we get into the playoffs here. But in terms of fantasy points per game, Matt Stafford was QB3, Drake May was QB4, and Trevor Lawrence was QB5. All of them were quarterback 15 or later in terms of ADP. And on top of that, you have later breakouts, guys like Jackson Dart, Jacoby Brissett, even Tyler Shuck, down the stretch. All these guys turning in productive fantasy games. I mean, more productive than their much higher drafted counterparts here. So this is the perfect example year for wait on quarterbacks. And we could go back, many years for a stretch and found, out of the last 5 years, there's at least a QB1 for 3 drafted outside the top 15. There's always someone there. So if anything, this year more than anything resulted in the wait on quarterback stretch. Now, to Josh Allen's credit, he was the leader in terms of fantasy points per game. But of course, he just, hurt you in the playoffs there when it mattered the most. So, that was one knock on him. Outside, he was possibly one of the only ones that really returned that value you were hoping for.
Yeah, Jalen Hurts, been disappointing outside of getting rushing touchdowns. Lamar Jackson was injured for much of the year. Jaden Daniels injured much of the year. Joe Burrow injured. I mean, that's 2 of the top 5, and I don't think you're really excited about having Jalen Hurts
on injury. And with Lamar Jackson, he was not playing well when he was in the lineup.
That's true.
You could say the same for Jaden Daniels, maybe because he was never quite 100% healthy here. Joe Burrow played very well down the stretch here, but again, unless you rebound in some other way early, a lot of teams got burned by his injury. So
I think
along
the same lines for you, my first takeaway entering in 2026 is, what is the point of drafting a tight end high or drafting a tight end at all. I mean, it dates back to our conversation last week when we were discussing our waiver wire winners, right? I mean, Jawan Johnson, Harold Fannin were arguably two of the top waiver wire pickups overall. And this is referencing an article I saw a friend of RotoWire, Scott Pianowski, put together on Yahoo that 16.1% of Yahoo championship winners had Trey McBride on the roster. And that was the windfall, right? That was the win if you had the top tight end. Brock Bowers didn't end up turning out very well. George Kittle got injured immediately. That hurt a lot of our RotoWire fans in particular, or at least colleagues who've been drafting George Kittle high. If you had McBride, you were happy with that. I think you got like wide receiver 5 production, much less tight end 1 production. But in my mind, I look at some of the guys that were were rostered ahead of Trey McBride. It was Brenton Strange, Jawan Johnson, Harold Fannin, all had close to 20% roster rate on the championship winning Yahoo teams. And I had been somebody that was fading the Brock Bowers and Trey McBride part of things very early into drafts last year. I wasn't convinced Bowers would do the same that he did the previous season, and I don't know if he would have or not, given how bad the Raiders were. But he had that injury literally week 1 and never was the same and missed a bunch of time. McBride needed Jacoby Brissett to be the quarterback in order to I think, get the fantasy value that you're hoping to have. And frankly, the people I were drafting, like Evan Ingram or TJ Hawkinson, which was like tight end 6 or 7, that was frustrating. Travis Kelce finished as tight end 5 in full point PPR leagues, but I don't think you're ever happy to be rostering him. Exactly. And in that middle tier of tight end, if you got Tyler Warren or Tucker Kraft correct, and I think those were correct, bad quarterback play, injury Tucker Kraft, that didn't end up having the win too. So I just kind of say this, Jake, like, what is the point of drafting a tight end high when I feel like now more than ever, it's very easy to identify who the waiver wire candidates are that you might want to have in roster for the rest of the season?
You're very right, I think, for the most part, but I'm going to take a slight adjustment. I mean, Trey McBride did break the receptions record. I took McBride at the first round turn in Fishbowl, and that turned out, with the special tight end rules there, that turned out to be the exact right move. No regrets there necessarily. Trey McBride was the outlier, and I think you could make a case for Bowers as well. Obviously, the Raiders are bad, and I'm going to go on another tangent here pretty soon about drafting players on bad teams. But, when Bowers was in and healthy, things were good for the most part here. So I think you could still draft. You're going to get Bowers at a bit of a discount next year, and I will take a 3rd round Bowers next year. I'll still do that. Trey McBride's going to go at the 1-2 turn next year. That's just the way.
He's going to get the Travis Kelce.
Enough to do that. And I know it won't be Jacoby Brissett. It'll be a whole new scheme, whatnot. But I think Trey McBride is proof. Like he's immune to a lot of that stuff, I think. And we'll see that next year. What I'm going to amend here is taking a tight end, any of the 4 through 10 tight ends that you don't touch. If you don't find a situation where you end up with McBride or Bowers, I can't trust Kittle just because of the injury history anymore. He's great when he's out there. He's just not always out there. Then you might as well wait and punt the position and stream it at the end, because Sam Laporta, obviously there was the injury, but he wasn't lighting anything up beforehand. TJ Hawkinson, gigantic bust. I'll take the L on that one.
Me too.
Travis Kelce actually ended up okay, but I'm not going to. Travis Kelce will be if he doesn't retire, he'll be in the 4 through 8 ADP range. I'm not going to touch that next year, especially if Mahomes is missing time early on. We'll see if he's back for the opener. Mark Andrews, no interest. Evan Ingram, Tyler Warren, maybe. We'll see what that quarterback position looks like here. But essentially, the lesson learned isn't not draft a tight end at all, because there are a couple that are proof to this rule. They're going to cost you for sure. Maybe it's a buy low on Bowers, or if you're really in a pickle at the turn, you could take McBride, and I wouldn't fault you for it. But taking anyone else in that 4 through 10 range, get rid of it. I'm out on those.
Okay, well, so again, referencing the Scott Pianowski article, at 16.1% of Yahoo championship winners had Trey McBride. Jawan Johnson, Harold Fannin, Brenton Strange were all higher roster rate. All 3 of those guys were people that we reference in the show every single week. So I'll turn it back to you, Jake. I understand why drafting Trey McBride would be lucrative, but you have to get it right. You got a 1 out of 3 chance at it this year with George Kittle and Brock Bowers, and both of those were wrong. If you got McBride, fine. I think in your tight end premium Scott Fishbowl league, you're probably more incentivized to take him, but I don't think it was like you were not the guy that was pounding the table on Trey McBride. So if we have a 1 of 3 chance at getting the top tier tight end correct, why not just wait to go ahead and identify the guy that by week 2 we will know gets a volume place within an offense? There will always be a new Jawan Johnson's my point, and I think I'll gladly go ahead and get that in free agency as opposed to speculating on which one it might be in a high pick or otherwise.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you make a very compelling case, and I can agree with that. I think there are some exceptions, but you're right. You're probably safest overall just skipping it. But I'm just saying that I will pay for McBride and take a slight discount on Bowers if given the opportunity, but nobody else. If none of those, if the draft isn't falling to a case where one of those guys ends up in my lap, then we're out.
The only other takeaway that I had for this year, at least one that I felt like I could expand on thought process, probably fits your mold of talking about bad teams. We'll get to your thoughts in a second, but I think I'm going to end up drafting running backs higher come next year. And I was looking on Reddit a lot over the holidays and just see people's championship teams. And there's a bunch of people like, I drafted 3 running backs in the first 3 rounds. Here was Christian McCaffrey and James Cook and Devon Achane. It's like, okay, the leagues that I play in, I played in 17 this year. A lot of them are more high stakes than something like that. And I think the quality of opponent that you're drafting against and strategizing against, it's a little bit different than maybe your friends and family. Like, I won't go to that extent of taking running backs high, but it really goes back to what we have done all year on the show, identifying waiver wire running backs. It was really hard to find a winner. I mean, like Kenny Gainwell ended up probably being the top option that we discussed. And, there are guys like Trey Benson that we thought we were high on. Blake Corum was widely available in far too many leagues by the end of the year still. But it just seems harder and harder to identify the running back waiver wire pickup. I think the idea of 0 RBs in the future just doesn't make sense unless you are guaranteed to know who the Jalen Warren is of this year or whatever else. And,
exactly. And if you go into next year looking at the rankings, I think Bijan Robinson is going to be your home run number 1 overall.
I would assume, yeah.
Next year, he's going to be number 1. And then I think 2 or 3 is Jahmyr Gibbs. And I think Jonathan Taylor will be a little overrated next year based on his early start. Christian McCaffrey will be in there if you do that coin toss.
Mm-hmm.
And the only other top 5 players that aren't running backs, the way I look at it, are going to be Chase again and Puka Nacua. And then maybe you throw, Amon-Ra St. Brown just because of the safety in there. You don't get too many safe picks anymore.
I think Devon Achane's a first rounder as well next year, right?
Devon Achane is interesting to me because I'm with you a little bit in where I don't know if his build is going to keep him healthy 16 games, and we've seen maybe his best years already here. But yeah, Devon Achane will end up in the first round here. There's just they're going to have a whole new quarterback, probably a whole new system. We'll see if it works the same way next year. There's going to be some red flags on Achane compared to those other 5 guys I just discussed.
It's going to be hard to find a starting running back, I think, with the knowledge that we have right now and the discussions that we have about waiver wire running backs, things like that. Yeah. What has not been hard the past couple of years, and I think this dates back to last year too. I remember us struggling to find a waiver wire running back for the awards last season as well. We have been pretty easily able to identify at least waiver wire receivers to pick up. Now, is everyone going to be Michael Wilson towards the end of last season or this season? No, I don't think we're going to find a Michael Wilson again next year, but whereas everyone's hyper focused on here's the target counts and snap counts of running backs and things like that, you could see the volume and the snap share often correlating with these receivers, and it doesn't seem like they're obvious pickups. Like you could have gotten the Kayshon Bouttys right early on in the year with just the deep play opportunities. Alec Pierce at one point was waiver wire receiver that didn't kind of emerge beyond that.
But carried you in a deeper league,
yeah. I mean, like target share is a stat that is very easy to understand, but has not really correlated into being a waiver wire commodity right off the rip. So I think you could find waiver wire receivers pretty easily, at least wide receivers 2s or 3s or flexes, whereas you can't do that with running backs. So I think I'm going to be drafting running backs high, and if they get hurt, well, whatever. That's just my luck, and I'll have lost the league anyway. But I think it's easier to acquire depth receivers that you can play throughout the year as opposed to running backs, at least what we've seen the past 2 seasons now.
Yep. Yeah, sure. I can get on board with that. And then the only other big takeaway that I wrote down is it's something that we kind of do every year, and it seemed to emphasize itself this year, and it's avoiding just bad teams and offenses. And there are pluses and minuses to this. So, going in, avoiding bad offenses, I ended up with 0% exposure to Ashton Genty, 0% exposure to Justin Jefferson. Great, right? It ended up worked out. That wasn't all by design. Somehow that's how the draft ends. But I still ended up, with a little bit too much Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson there. I couldn't help myself. I thought I was getting the value there. Next year I'm just going to try to tell myself, don't bite, go for the good teams. Now, if you're going to play devil's advocate on that, doing that strategy might have kept you away from Jonathan Taylor, which would have been great in the playoffs, not so great early in the regular season. I won a points championship because of JT here. Might have kept you away from JSN if you stuck to it too strictly, because people going into the season, remember, everyone thought the Colts and the Seahawks offenses were not going to be so great. So yes, it's good in theory. Obviously, it involves picking which teams are going to be bad correctly, but you get to a point where you're like, okay, well, the Jets are going to be bad, the Raiders are going to be bad, that kind of thing. If you avoided the Panthers, I remember they were one of the lower over-under win totals. Same thing with the Saints. I mean, maybe you got somewhere with Olave, towards the end of the year. But
I think you did fine. Olave was like wide receiver
you feel
5.
safer avoiding
did
those
fine
entirely, and did fine. So yeah, we have this in the RotoWire draft tools. You can add this to your draft plan and rank it high. I only want to take teams with good offenses, and the rankings that you put in there will reflect that. So that's another tool that you can use on the RotoWire site when prepping for your drafts next year. But it reared this year. I mean, out of all the busts that weren't related to injury this year, the great majority of them were because they played on bad teams. And that's just kind of where we're at.
There's always going to be outlier examples. I think people are going to be screaming at us in the radio, about Brian Thomas Jr., right? Who's probably the biggest bust of the entire year that wasn't injury related on a really good offense that a lot of people project to be pretty good. We won't ever be able to understand those situations, but I think there is a correlation between bad offenses and then not wanting to have those players. I don't. Yeah. You didn't want to have any Jet players this year. You want to have any Brown players this year. I think most people expected both those offenses to be bad. And outside of Harold Fannin, who was a waiver wire pickup, you were right to be on that kind of side of things. I guess Judkins maybe a little bit different.
And then, of course, the tight end ended up being wide receiver 1, for that team,
right.
Which is crazy. And Judkins will be, obviously the injury is going to mess with his ranking next year. But no, in general, that philosophy holds. And at the very least, if you're trying to decide between, like the example last year would have been T. Higgins versus Garrett Wilson. Right. You might have taken, I might have taken Garrett Wilson in a lot of those situations. I drank the Kool-Aid thinking that hype with Fields, maybe they were going to turn it around. Obviously it didn't quite work out, but like the T. Higgins, Garrett Wilson was the classic dilemma. Like Higgins would have been better for you, even though he missed time with injury. Garrett Wilson missed the whole back half and wasn't even really that good when he was playing.
Yeah, the quarterback play definitely hurt the Jets, and it's going to be one of the reasons why they're picking very high. We'll have to see if they choose to improve that position or how they choose to improve it this offseason. Let's talk about the playoff rankings here, and I'll let you kind of, in just a second, go over the model that we're discussing, but I'm actually really excited to have this conversation, and rightfully so, because we have a partnership with Draftkings, and they have a really cool best ball going on.
To roll the clip.
I was going to say, let's hear it from Nick here.
The NFL postseason is almost here, and playoff best ball on Draftkings is back. It's your home for playoff best ball. And this year, it's bigger than ever because our partners at Draftkings are featuring a massive $3 million prize pool and a $1 million top prize in Draftkings' largest contest to date. Are you new to playoff best ball? Well, it's the easiest way to get involved in the playoff action without the weekly grind. Just draft once, and that's it. Each round, your top scores automatically count. That means no roster moves, no weekly management. Just build your squad and let it ride all postseason long. All you have to do is download the DraftKings Daily Fantasy app and draft your playoff best ball lineup for a shot at the $1 million top prize. Drafts stay open until the postseason kicks off, so now's the time to jump in. You draft it, we crown it. So sign up now using the link in the episode description below to take your shot at $1 million in DraftKings' biggest playoff best ball contest ever. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY at 467-369. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-7897-777 or visit ccpg.org. 18 plus in most eligible states, but age varies by jurisdiction. Eligibility restrictions apply. Void where prohibited. See terms at DraftKings.com. Sponsored by DraftKings.
Okay, and we're talking about the playoff best ball, but there's really a lot of different playoff formats out there, and I think just expanding upon the strategy when drafting playoff teams is something I want to discuss. So,
I was going to do a bit here because the DraftKings best ball, obviously, you're taking your best lineup here. That's a very common way to play. We think everyone should sign up for our friends over at DraftKings. It's a great contest. They do all the scoring for you, which is excellent. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it, which I believe some sites out there host. I mean, I'm not going to mention that right after DraftKings, of course, but you can. Where you draft, with 3 to 5 of your friends, and you get your entire roster's points through the entirety of the playoffs. And that's kind of the format that I was thinking here. I've done this, with my friends. You kept track on Google Sheets before, where you draft 2 quarterbacks, 3 running backs, 4 receivers, a tight end, 2 flexes. Maybe you do kickers or defenses. And there's no best ball component. You just get your players for as long as they last in the NFL playoffs here. And I like to just use DraftKings scoring because then all you have to do is enter the DraftKings contest every week and you have all the players there instead of calculating the points up by hand. But you can score it, I guess, however you want, and you can do the roster settings however you want, whether you want a kicker or not, your defense or not. I guess that's up to you. I like to play without that. Do skill positions only, makes it easier to score, easier to focus your thing. If you do use kicker, I recommend a team kicker so you don't get burned by an injury necessarily. But yeah, so this is one of those. So it's a very different way to play fantasy because not only are you looking at the best players, you want players that are on teams who you think are going to get multiple games, if not the Super Bowl. If your stack in the NFC and the AFC are the teams that meet in the Super Bowl, you win even if you miss out on the players. I mean, Christian McCaffrey, for example, is a full standard deviation, 7 fantasy points per game higher than RB2. But if you don't think he gets past the Eagles in the first round, somebody like, I don't know, maybe a Kyron Williams or even a Zach Charbonnet, if the Seahawks, who are Super Bowl favorites, move to end up getting to the Super Bowl, they're going to end up with a lot more points. So it's another interesting dynamic here with how you pick your players. You can, I have a cheat sheet that I'm using to just do fantasy points per game among players in the playoffs, but that definitely needs to be adjusted by playoff odds and even first round odds there. And then the other thing with these formats that is different from standard season long fantasy, we mentioned waiting on quarterbacks right at the top of the show for season long. In this type of formats, I would argue that outside of maybe 1 or 2 exceptional skill position players who we'll get to, quarterbacks are the most important just because they are the highest score. You want to get the quarterback that makes it to the Super Bowl. That puts you, if they're scoring 20 a game over 3 or 4 games, that they become the highest scoring player in this format. So I think quarterbacks are valued a little bit higher. And out of the first 2 rounds, I would guess if you're doing, say, let's say you're doing a 5-team draft, out of the first 2 rounds, I would guess 7 or 8 would be quarterbacks. And then, of course, there'll be the person that waits on that situation because they'll just take their pick of whoever's left at the end, in a snake draft. I almost always see these in snakes, not necessarily auction.
Yeah.
But I guess you could, if you wanted to do it that way, you might have to just figure that out on your own in a chat room of your choice here. But did I leave anything else about leave anything out about the formats and strategy?
No, I think you did a great job of breaking it down. I guess I'm more curious, especially this year. I believe here for the wild card weekend, 4 of the 6 teams are home dogs to begin the playoffs, and it's not just the NFC South division, but like the Bears, Packers right now. The Packers opened as, and this is dumb. It should have been this way, but they opened as 1.5 point favorites, for example.
I've got the Bears as 1.5 point favorites right now.
Okay.
What I'm looking at on Draftkings, but
that can change so much. The Packers did open that way, and whatever, it shouldn't have been. But I mean, to this overall conversation, I don't know if there is a favorite, which actually makes this a really interesting thing. If you're picking up postseason fantasy for the first time, it would be a whole lot easier for me to answer this question: who do I think will win the Super Bowl or be participant in the Super Bowl? If just I know what the results of this week are, but when you're drafting, you don't. So let's go over this. I mean, is there a favorite in your mind? Is there teams that you feel like you would want to commit to saying they will win multiple games during the postseason?
Yeah, so this is really tough, and it plays into our rankings significantly here because technically the Seahawks at plus 350 are the favorites to win the Super Bowl. But out of the, I mentioned you wanting to take quarterbacks first. One, they missed the wild card game, so they're not playing in the wild card. That's one less round they could have. And 2, Sam Darnold is ranked 13th out of 14th among starting quarterbacks in fantasy points per game here. So taking that into account, and then looking at the other side, you have the Broncos and Bo Nix, our cover boy. The Broncos are actually what do I have here? Plus 650 to win the Super Bowl here, and they're also missing a game. So stacking Broncos might not be the situation here. Here's where I arrived, when thinking about this, and it starts taking us into our rankings, at least to the quarterback situations. I would argue that both Matt Stafford and Drake May come in ahead of Sam Darnold and Nix in terms of your rankings here if you're doing this playoff draft. The Rams are plus 425 to win the Super Bowl. That's better odds than the Broncos. The Rams are a team I like. And even better, even though they're on the road in Wild Card Weekend, they are minus 10.5 over the Panthers right now. The Panthers, of course, 8-9 getting into the playoffs because of that division just being so bad. But out of all of these wild card games that I'm looking at, I am not super confident in any of them necessarily here. I mean, I kind of like the Bills, who are 1.5 road favorites over the Jags. I kind of like the Texans being 3-point road favorites over the Steelers. but I'm not crazy confident. I am crazy confident the Rams are going to go and take care of business this year. And for that reason, I think that depending on your preference here and depending on what you think and where you draft, I think that it's either Matt Stafford or Puka Nacua that go number one overall in this league. If you're doing PPR DraftKings scoring like we remember, especially with the 100-yard bonuses, I think you could make a case to take Puka Nacua 1 overall or take him 2 or 3 and hope that Stafford comes back and somebody else is like, okay, well, I'm going to take Bo Nix or I'm going to take Josh Allen to get that, or maybe someone wants to take Christian McCaffrey just as the best fantasy point per game overall score. But I think your objective in this format is to see how you can get that Rams stack, whether it's Matt Stafford or Puka, that would be the dream scenario, or Stafford and even Devontae, who is going to play in the wild card round after missing a couple of games. In terms of fantasy points per game, Devontae Adams is wide receiver 3 of the entire playoff pool here. So, that's a solid stack that you can get to. Even Kyren Williams in there here. You can make a case for Kyren Williams over McCaffrey because the Eagles are 4.5 point favorites over the Niners at home the first week. McCaffrey is the number one overall, like almost 25 PPR points a game, but that does you no good if he's a one and done. Now, could the 49ers beat the Eagles? Absolutely. That could happen. And if someone takes Christian McCaffrey later in that situation and gets even 2 games out of him, that could turn out to be one of the best picks. But the way I'm breaking this down, the safest stack that you're going to be looking for is going to be a Rams stack because you're pretty confident they're getting 2 games. And then after you get 2 games, anything after that is bonus. If they end up making their way to the Super Bowl, defeating the Seahawks in the trilogy, who they'd have in round 2, which I think is very, very possible. Sam Darnold, the same thing happened to Sam Darnold last year, kind of turned into
exactly.
Well, like we say at the end of the year here, that could totally happen. And, the Seahawks defense is good enough at creating their own turnovers that they can make up for some of the Sam Darnold turnovers. But I still think that game is going to be a real tight point spread, when we get here to the playoffs. So I like the Rams' chances of at least playing in 2 games and, extending that possibly more. So if it comes down to me personally, I like the Rams stack, and that's kind of what I'm looking for.
I like this overall, and it's a great concept to expand on just because we can go the quarterback, running back, receiver rankings with this. Ideally, you're able to identify who the AFC team is as well, and I would agree with you. It's a little bit more challenging than it would be from the NFC side, and I think I'm leaning your direction that I believe the Rams are probably the right call, but we'll get into the actual quarterback, running back, receiver rankings of this here in just a second. Let's talk about one of the places where you can do playoff fantasy football here in the case of Playoff Blitz. If you're like us and hate when your fantasy season ends before the real football gets good, especially Week 18 football being so bad, you've got to try PlayoffBlitz.com. It's the fantasy football built for the NFL playoffs. No draft, no waivers, no sweat. Members can pick a lineup each week from the playoff teams. You can only use each player once. So once you start a player, you lose him. That's where the strategy kicks in. Remember, no need to hold a draft. Just create a league and invite your friends. Starting a league is super easy because it takes just about a minute and you're all in for the wild card weekend to the Super Bowl. PlayoffBlitz.com is your home for playoff fantasy football. Leagues are at $79. You can invite as many people as you like. Run an office pool, invite league mates from your regular leagues, or even, I don't know, just get your grandma's bingo league to whatever. Join today at PlayoffBlitz.com, where fantasy football meets the Super Bowl. Enter promo code ROTOWIRE. That's promo code ROTOWIRE for a discount on your league today. All right. If Stafford is quarterback 1, is there another quarterback that you think is close? Like if we're saying, hey, there's 4 people in this league that we're all drafting. We're doing a snake draft. Stafford and Nacua are 1 and 2. Is there an AFC component to this, or are we trying to get more of the fantasy production? Like, how would you handle the quarterbacks after Stafford?
Well, the next quarterbacks after Stafford happen to be in the AFC, and of course, there's going to be a little bit of personal preference here in this situation. But I actually think it's Josh Allen who enters number 1 in terms of fantasy points per game outside of this. And I know early on in the season we talked about his fantasy production maybe falling off a little bit towards the end. But the reason I say Josh Allen is, number 1, the baseline's a little higher. And number 2, I think that the Bills have a better chance of beating the Jags than the Patriots do beating the Chargers. And I know that's controversial because the numbers don't necessarily say that. Patriots are 3.5 point favorites. The Bills are only 1.5 point favorites. The safer pick might be Drake May. But the lesson that we're learning here is that my top 4 are Stafford, Allen, Drake May. All 3 of those rank ahead in my eyes of the top overall seeds over Sam Darnold, over Bo Nix. I think I would still put Bo Nix number 4 perhaps here, but that's kind of what I'd be looking at to get one of those. I like the Bills' path to some degree. They're a team with some playoff experience. I know they need to get over the hump per se, but I think, the defense is rough, but I think they've got just enough firepower on offense, and I've got enough confidence in Josh Allen to get them to a couple games, possibly the Super Bowl, even as the 6th seed. We'll see how that goes. And we'll take it from there. But I do think that just the baseline for Josh Allen makes him enough aside from the AFC. And then if you want to look at a couple of wild cards, CJ Stroud is someone that I'm looking at. I think the Texans can beat the Steelers. And then, if we end up Texans, Broncos, Bills, or even Texans, Chargers, I think they've got a good enough shot here. So the Texans are a low-key team that I might be looking to stack. And just for example, in terms of receiver rankings, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, after Puka and then maybe Devontae, I would say Nico Collins is the number 3 receiver you would take there. So again, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but again, looking at teams that are going to take multiple wins or take multiple paths, that's kind of how I have it. Stafford, Allen, Drake May, CJ Stroud, I guess, if you will. Jalen Hurts would kind of round out the top 5 if I had to go that way, I think.
So if Bills at the number 6 seed, if they beat the Jags at the number 3, theoretically, we're assuming the Patriots beat the Chargers. The Bills would then take on the Broncos because it reseeds itself. So it'd be 1 versus 6. I actually feel really good about the Broncos. I'm sorry, the Bills offense in that scenario. I think they could keep pace with the Broncos. It's just a matter of, can the Broncos get enough stops with that defense? Because I do believe the Broncos offense, specifically RJ Harvey, would be successful. So let's turn it over to the running backs next, because I think specifically in the case of both Kenneth Walker, Zach Charbonnet is number 1 seed for the Seahawks, but more importantly, the Broncos, does take that 1 week loss, again, in most playoff leagues, if that 1 seed is not playing, it's not like the points get doubled up. It's just now you're getting the Broncos at this spot to go ahead and theoretically divisional conference round Super Bowl. Is that worth in your mind? Because I could see a scenario, if it is the Bills, I'm like, man, RJ Harvey's probably a top 2 or 3 running back, and we don't think J.K. Dobbins returns at that point, or at least the broadcast Week 18 was saying he wasn't going to be available.
Yeah,
so how do you kind of quantify
J.K. Dobbins in these rankings?
Perfect, which is fine. I think that makes sense.
So if we go to the running back rankings, I'll just run the top 10 off here in terms of fantasy points per game, and then I'll go as to how I'm adjusting. Christian McCaffrey, number 1, 24.5. James Cook, 17.5. Josh Jacobs, 16. Derrick Henry, 16. Kyron Williams, 15 and change. Travis Etienne, 15. Omarion Hampton, 15. DeAndre Swift, about 15. Saquon Barkley, Jalen Warren, both around 14 fantasy points per game here. So it's almost 7 full points between Christian McCaffrey and James Cook. But I still don't put Christian McCaffrey as my number 1 running back overall. Obviously, if you think the 49ers are going to go into Philly and win, just getting 2 games out of McCaffrey would make him number 1. I personally don't. I would actually go Kyron Williams, number 1 overall. Just because of the whole Rams thing that we talked about, trying to get that Rams stack. And then I would actually put James Cook at number 2 because of the Bills path that I like. And then after that, I actually put Derrick Henry in here. The Ravens are not in the playoffs. I screwed that up. So I guess number 11 would be Rico Dowdle, and 12 would be Kenneth Gainwell. Something in my mind makes me want to put Henry in playoff rankings. So McCaffrey, Cook, Jacobs, Kyron Williams, Etienne, Hampton, Swift, Saquon Barkley, Jalen Warren, Rico Dowdle. Obviously, I'm not taking any Panthers in this situation because of the scenario I mentioned. The only Panther Bryce Young's going to get left out there unless you're doing an 8-team draft. Ted McMillan might get taken towards the end, but you're comparing Ted McMillan to like Pat Bryant, at that point when it gets to the rankings, or something along those lines. Even a Mumpfield situation here where you're taking wide receiver 3 or 4 on a team over wide receiver 1 on someone who only has 1 game. I mean, he would have to go out and have a massive game to do that. But anyway, so how I'm ranking them is Kyron Williams 1, James Cook 2, and probably Christian McCaffrey 3, just because of that potential. While I don't think it happens, if the Niners get hot, which can happen in the playoffs, and end up stringing a couple games. I mean, if the Niners go to the Super Bowl, Christian McCaffrey is the winning pick.
Right.
Huge if. So this, our analysis is one thing, and it's heavily going to be slanted on the teams that we think are going to advance multiple games. But if you have a really strong lean about one of these teams, or you think the 49ers are finally healthy and finally together, and ready to roll through this bracket here, then obviously, yeah, Christian McCaffrey is the number one pick. And I couldn't fault anybody for wanting to take that. And then coming back, you're going to want to continue that stack. You want to grab Purdy, grab Juwan Jennings, grab Kittle, all those types of players here. But obviously, you're dead on arrival if the 49ers don't win that game necessarily. I'm a big advocate for stacks. You have to make your stand somewhere. You can't have, exposure from 8 different teams. And it's the hardest thing. It's almost similar to the March Madness draft that we do, where you're going to have the 6th man on Duke over a 20-point per game scorer on New Mexico. You know what I mean? So this is kind of the situation here. And yeah, you can build up a lead, but by the time the Super Bowl rolls around, the owner, manager that has 5 teams on one that has 5 guys on one team that's still in the Super Bowl is going to slowly overtake you. So that's the situation we have. But I know I got sidetracked a little bit here. I've got those running backs down. If you look at just stats, RJ Harvey and Zach Charbonnet are very interesting because they were both 15 and 16 in terms of fantasy points per game, but both had really hot finishes to the season. So they probably bump into the top 10, maybe right outside that top 5 I mentioned there. Guys like Jalen Warren and Kenneth Gainwell that we think might be one and done are probably out. DeAndre Swift is interesting, but Kyle Mononga's jumped up right next to him, season long. Those guys get a little closer, especially if you think the Bears get past the Packers. I don't love Travis Etienne. Omari and Hampton's interesting because I think the Chargers could beat the Patriots. I wouldn't be shocked if that happens.
Okay.
And then you look at the Patriots running backs, Ramondre and Henderson are neck and neck. Do you really trust one of those, even if the Patriots are going a couple games? That's a really, really tough situation here. So, that's kind of what I'm looking at. Woody Marks interests me, assuming he's back and healthy. Even Blake Corum interests me a little bit. Like, Blake Corum should rank ahead of Rico Dowdle and Jalen Warren.
100%. Yes.
Just because of the scenarios that we've laid out and how these teams win. I mean, Blake Corum went out week 18, handled 14 touches, another solid, typical Blake Corum game. Blake Corum over 5 games is going to be better than Rico Dowdle over 1 game, even if he does greatly exceed, his strategy there. So again, that's kind of how the rankings are affected based on, outside of where things start. I mean, I would take Blake Corum over Travis Etienne almost. It gets to that point. So.
All right, so in the interest of time, we have the receivers and tight ends, but you had also kind of labeled some interesting stacks. I'll push back in the Jags when I actually am interested in the Jags part of the stack conversation. But before we do that, before we get to the receivers, tight ends, and the interesting stack kind of options, let's get to where our sponsors Dabble. Dabble isn't just another DFS app. It's the ultimate social platform where you can connect with other fantasy sports lovers. Dabble lets you win big, so you win 5,000 times your money this football season. Starting with Dabble, well, it's super easy. New users get $25 free when signing up, no deposit necessary. Check out the link in the episode description below to download Dabble right now. I think you kind of outlined, Jake, the receiver part of things, especially talk about Puka Nacua. The offenses that you seem to overall like, I think you would correlate that from a stacking perspective. So Nico Collins is the one I was going to ask about because you haven't mentioned a lot about the Texans other than we presume them to be favorites over the Steelers in Pittsburgh.
Yep.
I think that's probably the right call. So is the idea I'm going to get just 2 games out of this receiver, in this case Nico Collins, and therefore I'm going to benefit? Or why are you highlighting him more so than other options out there stacking-wise?
Well, I mean, looking down the list here, Nico Collins is almost a tier more productive here. I mean, there's a case for AJ Brown who comes in right after him. I think Cortland Sutton would be wide receiver 5 or 6 in that situation here. And then looking in terms of fantasy points per game, Christian Watson, DK Metcalf, both of those could be one and done. They're very risky here. The Chargers have, all these different receivers. They're going to get taken depending on how deep your draft goes, but they could easily be one and done against the Patriots here. Stephon Diggs is very interesting. Devontae Smith, Juwan Jennings, all of those guys are options here. But, guys that are 18, 19, Troy Franklin, Khalil Shakir, looking even down the list, Ricky Pearsall's an interesting sleeper. Luther Burden's an interesting sleeper. If you think they end up going a couple games, even like a Keyshawn Butte at 25 overall, if you end up getting 4 games out of him, that's way better than 1 game out of DK Metcalf. So things get interesting here. Yep. The dilemma here with the receivers is what to do with JSN, Jackson Smith-Njigba, led the NFL in receiving yards over the regular season, doesn't get the wild card game here. If he's one and done, he's no good. But remember, the Seahawks are technically the odds-on favorites to win the Super Bowl right now, and that means, beating what we presume to be the Rams and whoever else next. So JSN is going to sneak into the first round by someone who is going to go with the Seahawks stack. I mean, mathematically, they're the favorites. Why not? So I think after Puka and Devontae, well, you could make a case for putting JSN above Devontae, Puka, JSN, Devontae, Nico Collins, AJ Brown, Cortland Sutton, I believe are your top 6. After that, it starts to get really, really dicey here. I mean, you could go anywhere from Stephon Diggs to Devontae Smith to, starting the stack, your worst, your wide receivers, 2, 3, etc. on there. I mean, you could look at your Troy Franklin, Khalil Shakir. You could look at Jaden Higgins, even if you expect the Texans to win multiple games, they're down on the list. Even Cooper Kupp, because again, the Seahawks are your odds-on favorites here. All those guys you're going to be comparing to players like DK Metcalf, Quentin Johnston, Ted McMillan, even Ladd McConkey, Parker Washington, Jacoby Myers, all those guys that could very well be one and done. So there are the fantasy dominant guys are right at the top. It's Puka, JSN, Nico Collins, even, Devontae in there. So again, that's the theme. It's depending on where you're going to go with your strategy and also with your stack. If you end up with a quarterback, if you grab a quarterback, if you think you can get someone like Purdy late, then Jawan Jennings bumps up your rankings a little bit because you want to stack these teams up and get, double points for all their big plays.
I'll frame it this way, and I'm not sure if I even feel this strongly, but I think it's a point of conversation. I feel more confident the Seahawks are going to face a lower-seeded NFC team than I feel like the Broncos will face a lower-seeded AFC team, which to me means I think the Seahawks will beat the lower-seeded NFC team and therefore get 2 games. Because I think the Seahawks get 2 games, JSN to me is still worthwhile picking as opposed to Cortland Sutton. There are matchups where I think the Broncos make sense of those lower-seeded AFC teams. Again, I mentioned the Bills, for example. I would like RJ Harvey in that scenario. I do think the Jags can make this competitive. I'm not just trying to appease our Jags fan, Nick Whalen, for example, who's at the RotoWire
I'm not writing them off entirely. I'm just trying to pick some stacks on the AFC side, and they're not as obvious.
And I think from the AFC, like you could definitely and very easily put together a Trevor Lawrence ETN stack. You can grab a Brenton Strange relatively cheap. You could pick one of the receivers, multiple of the receivers if you want to, and say the Jags will win multiple games. And more so than ever, I think the answer has always been, well, which team do you think is going to get to the Super Bowl? I have no idea. If I am drafting today, I don't know who that answer is. But if I can answer it, who do I think wins 2 football games? To your point, Jake, earlier about what we're kind of looking at to get the point total to the end of the year. I think the Jags are probably the cheapest of the teams that I think could win or at least get to 2 playoff games right now of guys that have fantasy prominence. Technically, you could say the Panthers could win 2 or get to play in 2 games. Again, not win, get to play in 2 games, and they'd be the cheapest. Like the Panthers did beat the Rams, for example. But I don't want Bryce Young. I don't think Ted McMillan does a whole lot in those scenarios. I think Rico Dowdle is super fantasy valuable, and you could remove the Steelers from that equation too. So when we really boil down to 12 teams that we want pieces of, I wonder if the Jags is actually the stack that makes the most sense that can be a part of 2 fantasy games here in the fantasy postseason.
And they're kind of a backdoor stack. And because you can remember, if you end up with the 5th or 6th pick, depending on how many participants, some of these stacks that we talked about are just going to be out of the question. You're not going to be able to get a Rams stack unless everyone really decides they're going to sleep on Stafford. And so you might have your stack chosen for you, and you just kind of have to hope, you know what I mean? And I think the Jags stack might be cheaper than the Bills stack. It's definitely going to be cheaper than the Patriots stack. It might even be cheaper than a Broncos or Texans stack. So you can grab, Lawrence, and it's so funny that we're talking about Parker Washington and Jacoby Myers ahead of Brian Thomas at this.
I know, right?
But you can grab Lawrence and maybe maybe get your NFC quarterback or a top running back, and then come back in rounds 3, 4, 5 and start piling up your Jags. Like the Jags are going to be an achievable stack to get, one of the more underrated achievable ones. And sometimes in these, you just got to zig when the other owners zag, and find sometimes what falls into your lap just works. These playoffs are going to be, I don't think these matchups are. It's going to be volatile. Like I said, like we both agreed, there's no clear cut favorite. So if there is, I still advocate stacking even in a year like this because you need to get that one team. But if there is a year where you just go best player available and let the chips fall where they may, knowing you might get 2 or 3 good players in the Super Bowl compared to someone that's getting 6 players in the Super Bowl, but 4 of them might be reserve depth kind of bad players. That's a viable strategy for you this year too, although I still think it's stacking is the way to go.
Can I interest you in a Packers stack, Jake? I mean, we're talking about just getting 2 games. They don't have to win.
Yep.
Just get 2 games. Packers against the Bears. I think you would have preferred that one over the Eagles, right? Because that was on the table at various portions last on Sunday.
Yes.
If they beat the Bears, you're then going against the Seahawks defense. Very good. Obviously, that's where I kind of say I think JSN is one of the guys I'm very comfortable taking still if there's a discount at all. I think the Packers could beat the Bears. I actually feel like that was probably my preferred matchup if we could possibly walk into the playoffs now, having lost 4 games. Who do I want to go against? It is the Bears. I don't know. I mean, anything can happen against the Seattle defense as well, too. I think Jordan Love is capable of dissecting anybody. Is the Packers a favorable stack for you as like a Zag?
Yeah, it's absolutely viable. And I tried to avoid too much Packer talk, early in the show here. But the Packers are going to be one of the cheapest readily available stacks. And if you're going late and want to grab Love, the tough part is I think Watson is the clear receiver that you stack with Love. And then after that, things get, really volatile. Is Dobbs going to be taken? Probably Dobbs would be 2, Jalen Reed, number 3 here. But you might even say that Josh Jacobs warrants a higher pick than Watson. It's going to be really close. But yeah, I mean, this isn't even that outlandish. The Packers opened as favorites and it flipped to the Bears only 1.5 point favorites. Right. This game is a coin toss. And if we go back just a couple weeks ago, the Bears needed the most miraculous set of circumstances. They needed 6 things to go perfectly right and fall into their laps, including recovery and an onside kick, to be able to beat the Packers, who were missing several of their key players on both sides of the ball, and the Bears were at home. I mean, this is a game that the Bears needed a miracle run of things to happen to beat the Packers' backup quarterback, essentially after, Love got knocked out of the game in the dirty hit. Assuming we get Love for a whole game, that they get a little bit healthier on both sides of the ball, we'll see what happens there. It's very possible the Packers could win a game, and then, you're playing with house money after that. You're getting 2 games out of that. You're getting 2 games out of a stack that you probably built in rounds 8 or 9. Obviously, that's going to be harder for us to do with our buddies in Wisconsin. Somebody's going to do the Packers a little bit earlier, but, in your traditional format, the Packers are going to be very, very cheap. And listen, it's certainly possible here. And I certainly couldn't fault anyone for wanting to do that. And that's why I like, having the Draftkings best ball or other formats that we want to look at. So I can go and grab a Packers stack in a format of randos throughout the country, instead of my, the fun little office group here or, the friends and family situation here. No, I could be very much talked into a Packers stack. Say I take, Stafford, or I take Josh Allen really, really early. And one thing that you can do is wait. If it's a 4 or 5 team pool and everyone else has both their quarterbacks, then yes, you can wait because you have your pick. At the end, you can't flex a quarterback. You have your pick. Then just wait for Jordan Love at the end and maybe grab Watson or Jacobs in between at a cheaper price in rounds 7 or 8, I guess you could say. So yeah, I could be talked into that very much. And of course, if the Packers do go on a run, which is tough to see the way that they ended their season, but if they manage to go on a run, that late stack is what wins you the thing. So ultimately, you have to decide which teams you're going to plant your flag on to make deep playoff runs in these types of playoff formats. And sometimes if you're picking later in the draft, that decision might be made for you. But I still am an advocate of a stack. Even if you end up having to piece together a Jags or Eagles stack that isn't your first choice, you got to run with it and give yourself the best chance to have multiple players in the Super Bowl.
All right. Well, that does it for us officially in the final podcast for us of the year. Jake, it's been an honor to be able to do this with you. And I hope that a lot of people get to do some playoff best ball. I'm excited to have my draft with Alan Tazowski and company come Wednesday. I don't know if it's going to be on this station or somewhere else, but we're going to have plenty of NFL draft playoff coverage if you are interested in those kind of leagues. But otherwise, we'll have a sign off now for the final part of this year. Well, I guess we'll come back this year, but back more in July and August as well. But thanks everyone for listening to our podcast on Monday here.